So hello, everybody. I'm really excited to be back here with Richard Rohlin to continue the universal history. If you have not seen our first video, it has really taken off and also just sparked so much discussion. He's now flooded with emails, he tells me, of all these people who want to ask him about everything from universal history to psychedelics. And so I'm really happy that that's happening because Richard is a very interesting person. And I'm looking forward to kind of continuing this conversation as we move forward. So Richard, what is it that you wanted us to talk about today?
So now that we've laid out the idea of universal history and tried to establish the idea that the way that they thought about history in the ancient and the medieval mind, that way of thinking about history and of reading history still has value and meaning to us. What I thought that we could do would be to take a closer look at one of the main patterns that I see within Western history, within the whole medieval project. And by Western, I mean the whole medieval Christian world, so including Byzantium and that. And so what I thought we could do is take a closer look at this, one of the main patterns that manifests itself kind of over and over again, and that really helps us to navigate the moment that we're in right now. And that's the pattern of Christ and Antichrist. So this actually starts, I want to start with kind of a deep pull here that maybe a lot of our listeners won't be familiar with. And that is a guy named Mithradates VI of Pontus. So Mithradates is a super interesting guy. He ruled over the kingdom of Pontus and over much of Anatolia. Again, so this is a guy, he's from the East, he's specifically from Anatolia, which seems to keep coming up for some reason. And he's actually a descendant of both Alexander the Great and also of Cyrus.
Interesting. Yeah.
So he basically understood himself. His self-understanding was that he was the inheritor of both East and West, of both Greece and Persia, right? So he's living, Anatolia is the space that's sort of like on the border between these two worlds. And so he understood himself as having inherited both of these things. And he has a lot of, let's say, messianic features about his life. There was a comet in the sky that was seen when he was born and all this other stuff. So he's a really interesting figure. And when he's quite young, I think about 10 years old or so, his mother actually tries to kill him along with his father, and kills his father, but Mithridates escapes. And he spent the next 10 or 15 years kind of on the run in hiding. And he's traveling around to all these different tribes and these different kind of wild groups that are on the edge of Anatolian civilization. And he's making alliances. He's learning how to lead. He's learning how to fight. He's learning how to poison. His nickname is the Poison King because he just poisoned so many people.
This is in the 1st century BC, is my understanding, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And so he also one of the things he's really famous for was developing basically like a universal antidote. And we don't know if he really succeeded in doing it or not. There's kind of like conflicting evidence. But the thing that he's famous for is developing something called Mithridatum, is what it's usually called now, named after him. And it's the idea of basically it's got a small amount of every single poison in it. And so you take a dose of this every day, and you build up an immunity to iocane powder for those of us who are, Princess Bride fans. So Mithridates, he did that. He had this dose that was like all these herbs and small amounts of poisons and stuff, and he took it every day. And he lived a really long time. So I don't know what's going on there. I'm pretty sure like from a modern scientific standpoint, taking a little bit of arsenic every day is maybe not the best thing to do. And nobody really knows what was in it.
No one knows. Yeah, it's a lost formula.
Yeah, it's a lost formula. But during the Middle Ages, actually, the whole lot of people tried to figure it out.
It was like the philosopher's stone of poison.
Mm-hmm. It really, So anyway, so he comes back, poisons his mom, and takes over the kingdom, and becomes the worst enemy that the Roman Republic had fought since Hannibal Barca. And basically, he just becomes, he's considered one of the 3 great enemies by the Romans themselves, who always respected their enemies greatly. He was considered, along with Pyrrhus and with Hannibal, one of the 3 great enemies of the Roman Republic. He's eventually defeated by Pompey the Great and dies, according to history, dies by suicide. Of course, the story there is pretty fun. It's that he tried to poison himself, and it didn't work because theoretically he was immune to it. He was also just an enormous man, like physically enormous, very powerfully built. So maybe who knows? But anyway, so eventually he either stabbed himself or he had one of his slaves stab him. But when he died, because he'd been such a nuisance to the Roman Empire, when he died, there were legends which began to arise almost immediately after his death that he hadn't actually died. These legends that he had actually gone. He had a wife who was like one of his wives was like the Scythian Amazon warrior, and so he even like at one point had this like group of Amazons like as his bodyguard.
Really?
That he rolled with. I mean, yeah,
like Gaddafi.
Yeah, or like Wakanda or something.
Yeah.
Like he's a fascinating guy. All the stuff that I'm saying, by the way, there's a really fun book called The Poison King: The Life and Legend of Mithridates, Rome's Deadliest Enemy, and it's by Adrian Mayer. And you can find it on Amazon and Audible and places like that. It's a really fascinating piece of history. But anyway, so one of the legends is that actually he goes north with these Scythians, these Amazons, to Scandinavia, and that he is the origin of the Gothic people who come back for revenge against Rome a couple of hundred years later.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, or more than a couple hundred, but and so all the way into the time, like when Rome starts dealing with the really serious barbarian invasions, one of the beliefs that they had in Rome was that this was Mithridates coming back, and actually they identified Mithridates with Odin, and so it was actually a pre-Christian euhemerizing of Odin, where they identified this figure from their past with this very fierce warrior god, but who's also, I mean, Odin's not just a warrior god, he's a trickster figure. Yeah. Like he's always tricking people into things, which is very much like Mithridates and the way that he did things. So you had this idea then that let's say the pattern, and this is where the pattern of it's both the pattern of Christ and of Antichrist, right? The idea that you have a principality that is cut off, but then it reappears somewhere else unexpected later on. And so Mithridates is kind of the type of this. And one of the really interesting things that happens later in Roman history, after Nero's death, is that a lot of this gets transferred to Nero. So when Nero dies, and this is we talked about the Sibylline Oracles last time, right? This is in the Sibylline Oracles. Nero, the
resurrection of Nero, or the
resurrection of Nero. Yeah. And the idea is that Nero didn't really die, but that he actually escaped and he went to Persia. So it's always from the east, right? So he escapes and he goes to Persia, and then he's going to come back basically as this Antichrist figure, as God's instrument of judgment against the Romans. That's how it is in the Sibylline Oracles. So there's this idea that Nero, again, the idea of the principality being cut off and disappearing and coming back. Now, I said this is the pattern of both Christ and Antichrist, because of course within the Hebrew tradition, you have the idea of the stump or the root of Jesse. Right. So the idea, this is in the prophecy of Isaiah, so that's in like the 700s BC, that the line of David, the line of Jesse, is going to be cut off, right? And so a lot of times our King James translation says the root of Jesse, but it's the word in Hebrew is really the word for a stump. And so the idea that the line of Jesse, like a tree, will be cut off and it'll be just completely obliterated. And then in a time that's unexpected, that's unlooked for, they're going to start being these shoots that come up. And that's, of course, that's the church understands that as the Theotokos and as Christ. So that's the kind of basic pattern that we can establish. And so by the time we get to the book of Revelation, we see this pattern both in Christ and in the figure of Antichrist, right? So you've done a really great video on the what did you call it, the system of a beast? Is that what it was called? Yeah. I'm really waiting for part 2. I'm very excited.
It's becoming the most complicated thing I've ever written. I'm trying to write this video on the mark of the beast and explaining what a mark is to people. It's so deep that I struggle to do it in a way that won't just go over people's heads.
Yeah.
Or like it just kind of not seem like what I want to make it seem like. So it's coming. I worked on it last night, very late into the night.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. I'm really looking forward to it. So in the book of Revelation, right, you have both this pattern of Antichrist, right, the little horn in Daniel and the all that stuff, right? So it's the idea of a principality that gets cut off and then it comes back again later.
Yeah.
But then also ultimately that's also the pattern of Christ, and so it's not hard to understand the Antichrist as being sort of like the dark mirror of Christ. So if Christ is the master pattern, the Antichrist is the inversion of that somehow.
Yeah.
But what I think a lot of people don't understand, or what they get really hung up on, is you've got people who want to go and do just a purely historical reading of Revelation, and so they'll say, oh, well, this Antichrist figure here, the beast or whatever, that's a Nero. It's only Nero. It's just Nero. And the Christians mistakenly believed that he was going to come back, and he never did. And so there you can see Revelation is bunk.
Yeah,
that's
man. Yeah, I mean, it's silly because, like you said, there are so many versions of this pattern, and it has to do with it does have to do with something like the scapegoat. It has to do with something like the enemy or the evil that is cast out, but goes and wanders in the desert, let's say.
Yeah.
But that this wandering can end and that this thing can come back because those remainders never get dealt with. There's an ancient Scandinavian story about what is the demon Surt, I think he's called, where he comes to kind of attack the world and judge the world on a chariot made of everybody's fingernails. And this is the best image of what this is about. It's like you clip these little things off, these remainders of your body, your hair, your fingernails, all these remainders, and those have a power. I talked about this in the video I did. Actually, sorry, I realized it's a patron-only video on the symbolism of the inverted pentagram. Or talk about how
that was such a good video.
The idea that black magic is about understanding the power of these remainders, and how if we see the world, that because we understand that the world has a totality, that anything you cut off, it has a power, it has a possibility of returning in revenge, let's say.
Did you, this is a totally random question, but did you ever read a book by Terry Pratchett called The Hogfather?
I haven't. Someone sent it to me and I have it, but I haven't read it yet.
It's a fun book. It's one of my favorite books. It's kind of like fantasy, but it's also satire and everything. But like a major part of the plot revolves around collecting all of the discarded teeth of children so that they can do some magic, like something nefarious, right? But it's, so they have to like infiltrate the Tooth Fairy's castle and all this different stuff. And it's a kind of a funny story, but also like it's one of those stories that has these moments of symbolic intuition that are just like a little too on the nose.
Yeah, but there are many, there are many versions of this story. The problem of the castaways, the problem of the remainder. Like, it's funny because talking about Santa Claus, the entire story of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the TV show, that's what it's about, right?
Yeah.
The land of misfit toys.
Yeah,
all of this idea of these castaways that continue to kind of exist in the margins, and at some point, when the walls break down, they return. It's the same with Gog and Magog. The idea of putting these things out of the world and then they returning. And so the idea of the Antichrist is obviously, in Christianity, it's a way to deal with this. It's a way to understand that this is inevitable, that as Christ comes, he casts a shadow, and that shadow gets kind of put out of the world, but it has to return for things to become complete.
Yeah.
And the story kind of has to be resolved in a way that will encompass all of it together. And so that's why when I talk to people about the image of the New Jerusalem as being something like that, as being something like the crown of thorns, as the crown of thorns as being an image of trying to resolve the problem of these remainders that come in the fall, that this problem of cutting off aspects of reality and pushing them to the outside.
I really love, just as a kind of a side note, I really love thorns as a, that we see in the Genesis story, and of course, ultimately in the crown that Christ has on his head, as a symbol of the fall, as a symbol of chaos. Because the thing with a thorn bush is that it's something that literally has too many points.
Yeah.
And literally, it's got too many points. And that's the world that we live in today. It's a world where there's too much, everything is vying for significance. Like everything is disorganized. There's no real hierarchy of information, of knowledge, of attention, and just everything. Just the news cycle, Twitter, things like this, where everything is basically constantly coming into our view and saying, I'm the most important thing, give me your attention. I just at a totally unprecedented rate.
Exactly.
Too many points.
And so, but there's a sense in which this is part of the process. It really is the mystery, one of the mysteries of Christ, which is that as this multiplicity gets filled up in a way that sometimes is light, sometimes is scandal, in a way it's almost as if for Christ, all of this is coming together. You can't totally discern what's going on until finally this whole thing gets caught up together into a final revelation.
Yeah.
The image that Christ says that scandal must happen. I always come back to that image, but woe to those by who it happens. But the scandal is part of the revelation of Christ.
So the spoiler is that, Jesus wins, right? Spoilers.
Yeah, but in a way that might be very surprising to us. Like that's the thing.
That's the thing. Yeah. So you've got something like the Book of Revelation where here's this Antichrist figure, this beast figure that is clearly Nero.
Yeah.
Okay. And it would be useless to deny that, right? Because we know, you can read all the things that the early church wrote about him, and that even like non-Christian sources wrote about Nero. Like it wasn't just Christians who believed that Nero might come back as this really negative force, right? The pagans believed that too. So you have this figure that's clearly Nero.
I would say Nero's coming back right now. That's what I think.
Well, okay, but you say that. I don't know if you saw this, but I think it's the British Museum is just opened this exhibit about why maybe Nero was actually not such a bad guy.
It's inevitable.
When I saw that, I was like, well, of course. What else could have happened this week? This is it's very hard to surprise me at this point. So here's the inversion that we're dealing with right now, is that everyone hates Constantine, basically, except for us, like you, me, and Dr. Mario, I had a great exchange with him. It's really fun. And I'm actually really glad that you guys recorded your video before he saw our video.
Yeah.
Because it was just like this independent confirmation. Like the thing is, like, he knows so much more detail than I do about Constantinople itself. And so, for instance, I knew about the Palladium being taken to Rome. I had no idea that Constantine brought it or had one made or whatever in Constantinople. But like that really like takes that Troy connection we were talking about, makes it
brings
really
in
solid.
It is in a way. It's like he wanted it to not be Troy, but
Right.
Troy at the same time. Like
Yes.
he wanted to create something that was both connected to the ancient but totally new at the same time.
Yeah. So I loved that video. It was great. But everyone hates Constantine. So, but even as we're hating on Constantine, they were talking about taking down a statue of him in York as part of, I don't know if they ever actually did it, but back when America was tearing down all the Confederate monuments and things like this, in England they were doing something similar. And one of the things that they were talking about was there's this statue of Constantine in York, which I think is actually my cover photo on Facebook right now.
Yeah, I saw it. It's nice.
Yeah, but they were talking about like taking it down. I don't know if they did or not. I hope they didn't. But so even as they're like trying to get rid of Constantine, they're saying, hey, but maybe Nero wasn't such a bad guy. Like, if you think about what's going on right now, it's very much it's exactly the pattern of Antichrist, right?
Yeah, and the pattern of Nero is really powerful. Like in terms of if you want to understand what's happening now, because one of the things people struggle to understand is how what we notice around us right now is a weird mix of ultimate decadence and tyranny on the horizon. And people think, well, how is that possible? How can you have both extreme degeneracy and tyranny at the same time? But if you want to understand that, look at Nero, and you can see how that plays itself out.
Yeah.
And how Nero imposed his degeneracy on others.
Nero's,
like his desire to do that is because a lot of people think like, well, just let people be degenerate. Like, it doesn't matter, but that's not how it plays out. It ends up coming into a point of tyranny where Nero was imposing all his darkness on the people around him, and the people submitted to him.
So you're an artist. I was just thinking about this the other day. Like, what is the significance of the fact that Nero thought of himself as an artist? Like, that's what he saw himself as doing. I mean, if we, the story about his death is that his last words were something like, "How great an artist the world is losing," something like that, right? So what's this? I mean,
what is it? You mean in the world where, 20 years ago, the things that we're seeing the US president do would have been completely unimaginable. When Bill Clinton went on the Arsenio Hall show and played his saxophone, the world went crazy. This was like the massive scandal. Like, how can the president be involved in this entertainment world? And now it is taken completely for granted. Donald Trump was a wrestling villain. Like, Donald Trump has so much of Nero. Like, not all the aspects of Nero, but he has certain aspects of Nero in him, like the showman.
There are even some people who are afraid he's going to come back.
Exactly. Or want him to come back. Because some people in the time of Nero wanted him to come back too.
Yeah.
So I don't think Donald Trump is like, it's totally Nero, but I think that there are elements of Nero popping up, like the idea of the entertainment president, the idea of the president as a spectacle. All of this is becoming almost taken for granted. We think this is completely abnormal, but it's completely taken for granted.
Yeah.
So
the beast in Revelation.
Barack Obama went to work for Netflix.
Yeah, right.
Like, this is something which it was started even with Ronald Reagan. Like, the idea that an actor could become president, tell the founding fathers that, they would have just laughed in your face.
Well, tell anyone. I mean, like, even pagan Rome despised actors. Like, actors were the lowest. They're the lowest level of society. Like, they're under prostitutes as far as respectability goes in the ancient world. And so when you have somebody like, it wasn't just Nero. Like, there was some decadence leading up to Nero. So, for instance, during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, according to, I think it's Tacitus, one of the historians, I'm pretty sure it's Tacitus, he talks about the riots and the street fights that broke out in Rome during the reign of Tiberius over these rival troops of dancers, because there was like one troop of dancers that some of the aristocracy backed, and there was one troop of dancers that the emperor really liked, and people are having fights, like riots in the street over these different things. And Tacitus saw this, I think rightly, as a sign of the decadence and the sort of the impending, problems in Roman society, because you had people, actors and dancers, and those are sort of the same thing in, at this time in history, who are supposed to be on the very bottom strata of society. And now suddenly they're driving policy, and they're driving intrigue, and they're driving politics. And basically, like, if you had an actor driving politics, it's the same thing with like somebody like what's his name, Joaquin Phoenix's character in Gladiator, Commodus, who really did fight in the arena. Like, that's a thing he historically did. In fact, one of the things that Commodus did, I just have to go on a little tiny Commodus rant here, I'm very sorry. One of the things that Commodus did is that he would get a bunch of crippled war veterans together, and he would tie them all up, like 10 or 15 of them, tie them up in a big bundle in the middle of the arena. Of course, they're crippled, they're hobbled, they can't walk. And then he would dress as Hercules in like the lion skin cape and everything, and take a club and beat them to death one by one in the arena for his own amusement and the amusement of the people around him. I mean, these are crippled war veterans who can't fight back, right? And he would say, what he would say was that he was Hercules slaying the giants.
Yeah.
That was what he, yeah. So I think you're absolutely right. Like this idea of like a celebrity, like an actor, an entertainer, an artist, then, you know, suddenly becoming like the highest thing, like the principality that's now driving things. Like that's definitely part of the pattern of Antichrist. And it's really, I don't know, it's really interesting to watch what's going on right now on both sides. Like, you know, in America right now, Republican or Democrat, like the same pattern is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a circus.
So the beast in Revelation, to kind of get us back on track a little bit.
Yeah.
But the beast in Revelation is Nero, right? But he's also more than just Nero, right? This is something we talked about in our previous video. Reality lays itself out in these fractal patterns, right? So that, you know, these patterns that we have happening over and over and over again. And what what's going on in Revelation is taking history and recent history, the history that especially like the recent pain of persecution and of, you know, wondering, okay, where is God in all of this pain that's going on around me, right? Which is a very frequently asked question, you know. And then taking history and looking at history really through the lens of the liturgy. And you're probably aware of this, but there are now quite a number of biblical scholars and also some people who have done a sort of more mystical read of actually looking at the structure of ancient Christian liturgy and then reading the book of Revelation through that structure. And so that you actually see, you know, there's this moment, you know, where John eats the book, right? And that sort of corresponds to, you know, so that sort of corresponds to the moment of communion in the liturgy. So the idea is that you get this one vision of history that's like before communion, and then the whole thing is recapitulated again, but it's through the eyes of, like, through the sacramental lens. So you actually sort of get this view of history twice. And, you know, I'm not a Revelation scholar. I don't know how much there is or isn't to that. I think it's very interesting, but I think that on a certain like symbolic sense, or in a sense of, you know, the patterns that we find in the book of Revelation, I think there's definitely something true about that. So it's basically, so what Revelation is doing then, it's taking history, but it's saying there's something more going on here than just history.
Yeah.
Right. Something more is going on here than just the things that happened yesterday. You know, that the things that happened yesterday actually participate in this cosmic pattern, the end of which is that the New Jerusalem will descend. Right. Yeah. And so you can sort of take comfort in the final victory of Christ.
And so we have these two patterns. So we have the pattern of Antichrist, which also appears as a kind of mock resurrection, or as a resurrection. Mm-hmm. We see it in script in the Revelation itself as the idea of the fatally wounded beast that returns to prove the power of the beast. And so you can see that almost like as a mock resurrection. We saw it in the story of Nero. We see it as the return of this evil figure, whether it be Surt in the ancient in those kind of ancient cosmologies, whether it be the unleashing of Gog and Magog at the end of the world. All of this is part of how, when you come to the end of things, that which has been rejected will reign again. It will show itself because it has been cast out to the edge of the world. And so when you get there, it's like, you know, you're traveling. It's
there waiting for you.
Exactly. It's like you're traveling towards the end, and you push these things back, right? You push other things back because they're not part of the world. Like they're not conducive to the existence of the world. But then at some point you reach the end where there's more of that which you rejected than that where you came from. And so you end up in a circus and you know, the freak show, all of this kind of stuff that
chariot of
the world. Exactly. And so the idea of this idea of the return of Antichrist, or the appearance of this at the end of the world, makes sense even in terms of any normal process of the development of any story or any cycle or anything that exists. And so then you have this pattern of Antichrist, but then there's a bigger pattern, or there's something there's a mystery which flips it back, and like which defeats Antichrist or uses Antichrist against itself or swallows Antichrist. It's hard to sometimes completely understand it, but it's as if, when you reach the end, all these things, even the scandals, even the breakdown, all of this then suddenly gets brought together and it makes sense in the whole.
So maybe a good example of this that we can give people to sort of like key into on a narrative level would be the Arthurian material, which is really important for English-speaking people, even though ironically, like most Arthurian material actually comes from France. But it's funny, like in the Middle Ages, they basically considered there were three kinds of stories or three cycles of stories that were worth telling and retelling. There was the matter of Britain, which is written mostly by French people. There's the matter of France, which is written mostly by Italians. And then there's of course the matter of Rome, which is like the old Greco-Roman.
Yeah,
world.
The ancient,
the ancient stuff, the ancient mythology, right? And people realized that there was a high degree of fiction involved in these things. Like they weren't naive; they just didn't really but that didn't bother them.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And the matter of Rome also included Alexander, which is
matter of Rome included Alexander. Yeah. So to talk a little bit, last time we talked about the idea that Britain is founded by Trojan exiles and that Constantine kind of comes out of this. And if you read Geoffrey of Monmouth, he has this idea that there's this idea in the genealogies that he presents for Constantine and ultimately for Arthur, where the proper line keeps getting lost and then it survives somewhere else. So it's like so the idea is you have like, here's the king, this guy's the rightful king of Britain, but then he dies and all of his kids get killed except for the youngest son who was in France at the time. So he survives and he comes back, right? So it's the idea of the principality that gets cut off and then resurfaces. And that happens over and over again until eventually Arthur kind of comes about. And so Arthur has multiple iterations of this pattern of the messianic pattern in his lineage already. And so the idea is that this line of the idea of Roman, British, Trojans eventually produces, via this repeated pattern, it produces Uther Pendragon, and of course his more famous son Arthur. And I just have to point out here that if somebody says, starts talking, a few years ago, like maybe 100 years ago, there was this huge search for the historical King Arthur, and every few decades, like that becomes a thing again. I think the most recent time was like in the early 2000s, where that was like a really big focus in academia. But if somebody talks about the historical King Arthur being a survival of a Roman British general or something like that, they're not really contradicting the legendary material, and they're not really saying anything very important about it, right? Because the whole story of Arthur is the story of the seed falling to earth, being lost, and then shooting up again in kind of this unexpected place. And of course, in the case of Arthur, something you said in our previous video is that England is the edge of the world.
Yeah.
Right. So we have the seed falling to earth, being lost, and then shooting up again on the margin of the margin of the Roman world. And of course, this is the messianic pattern, right? Again, going back to the idea of the stump of Jesse, which is the springing up again of the long lost Davidic kingdom, once again on the margin of the Roman Empire. And then he becomes the Pantocrator. The idea is that Christ becomes something beyond the Roman emperor himself, which nonetheless contains the idea of the Roman emperor, which is, by the way, one of the things that happens in some of the Arthurian stories. Arthur actually is sort of acknowledged as like the emperor. And that's in Malory and some other places.
Yeah, there's some versions where they actually take Rome.
Yeah. So,
which is amazing.
If the story of Arthur contains Christ, we shouldn't be surprised that it also contains Antichrist, right? That there's something, and this actually begins with Arthur's birth, that there's something ambiguous and even kind of sinister, sort of left-handed about the parentage of Arthur himself.
Yeah.
So in the very early legends, Uther Pendragon is actually himself a shapeshifter. So he changes shapes and uses those powers to beget an illegitimate child on Princess Igraine of Cornwall. And this is later amended that he did this with the help of Merlin, who we probably just need a whole video to talk about, maybe Merlin, because,
Yeah.
and I know you've done some in the past, but he's a very interesting figure. So by the time of Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, the idea of illegitimacy is actually removed from the story. It's clarified that, okay, yes, Uther did rape Igraine, but when Arthur was conceived, it was already after they'd been legitimately married. So like they have to sort of clarify that Arthur is actually a legitimate son, and therefore it's okay for him to be king and all this stuff. But the problem here of illegitimacy that exists in the seed of the Arthurian story is never fully removed. It just gets transferred to these other characters in Arthur's immediate circle. So the story of Arthur that develops, particularly in the Francophone world, and again, most of the stories that we remember as the Arthurian legends, like Lancelot, Guinevere, the Holy Grail, all that stuff, come from French authors.
Yeah.
There are these really intricate patterns of, you could say, sexual deviancy in these stories, right? Which include things like incest, adultery, cuckolding. And I think that these stories are difficult. They're problematic. I hate that word problematic. I shouldn't use that. But they're difficult. They're difficult to sort of like look at and respond to. And to the point that when I was a kid, I wasn't actually allowed to read the Arthurian stuff. And it wasn't really because my parents like had read it themselves, I don't think, but they just sort of knew that like there was some adultery and some other stuff happening. And so I wasn't actually allowed, I mean, I read them anyway. I read Howard Pyle's The Boy's Own King Arthur, which actually doesn't have any of that in it. It's kind of sanitized. And just really fell in love with the Arthurian stories as a kid. But I think that people who have been paying attention to your videos recently, especially, and this is the Lil Nas X, or I don't even know how to say his name, but the Lil Nas X King Arthur connection that all of your viewers have been waiting for here. Okay, I think that if people go back and watch that video that you made on Lil Nas X and WandaVision, talking about the pattern of witchcraft, right, and sexual deviancy and the way that all relates to each other, that you will actually be able to understand something really profound about the Arthurian story. And that is that, in the most popular versions of the Arthurian legend, Arthur's relationship with his queen, Guinevere, is sterile, right? And there's no biological cause given for this. In fact, it doesn't appear to be like a problem with Arthur, right? He does actually sire a son due to a case of sort of accidental incest with his half sister Morgause, and this character Morgause, is the queen of Orkney. She's really interesting because she's from an island in the middle of the sea, right? This Orkney is this basically a rock in the middle of the North Sea. So she's from an island in the middle of the sea. You can think about the symbolic implications there, and then and she is. She's also the sister of Morgan Le Fay, who's this, and like her, she's associated, particularly in the later literature, both Morgause and Morgan Le Fay are associated with witchcraft, to the point that eventually the two of them are combined into a single character. So in most modern retellings of the story, they combine these two characters because there's this sort of sense, there's this intuition that they're a little redundant. Mm-hmm. And Morgause is herself, she's unfaithful to her own husband multiple times. And all four of her sons, including Mordred, who is Arthur's, bastard child, they're portrayed in the Francophone Arthurian material. And this includes Gawain, right, who is actually like a great dude in the British story. Like he's the original King Arthur's best knight. And then he eventually gets replaced by Lancelot in the French versions of the Arthurian material. And when he does,
French,
right, because Lancelot is French. Yeah. And so when he does, then suddenly all of these guys from the Orkneys, which if you are French, that's the literal edge of the world, right? They're portrayed as being uncouth, dangerous, capable of both great loyalty but also great harm. Like they're deeply loyal until they think you've betrayed them, even if they're wrong, and then they stab you in the back.
Yeah.
They are, in other words, sort of, you could say, shifty characters like the sea, right? and so this doesn't, like I said, this includes Gawain. Um, and although even in the British versions, and this is still in Malory, Gawain has powers that are cyclical. He becomes stronger or weaker with the cycle of the movement of the sun across the sky. So like he's strongest at noon and he's weakest at night. So there's something even in his British origins, there's something like cyclical and kind of wave-like about him. But the second reason for Arthur's lack of a legitimate heir is that he is cuckolded by Guinevere and Lancelot, right? So Guinevere carries on an also sterile affair with Lancelot, who has an illegitimate son of his own, right? So again, the problem is not Lancelot. Lancelot can totally have kids. And Lancelot's illegitimate son is Galahad, who is like the only really pure, righteous, virginal knight in the later Arthurian versions of the legend. So and so what we can see there is kind of this perpetuation of that Uther to Arthur fractal pattern of you have like a wicked father, or like a maybe not so much wicked, but just like a shifty father who begets this totally righteous son, right?
That has to do, like, just to help people understand also, is in order to understand this, we always have to remember that this is happening on the edge of the world.
Right.
Like the Arthurian stories are about it's almost like how can there be resurrection, or how can the seed be planted in unrighteousness and come up in righteousness? Like, how is that possible? Like, how does the world end and start again? And so all these irregular patterns that you see, all the sexual deviancy, all the incest, all of this has to do with the problem of dealing with this. And
it's almost like it was a way for these French authors to sort of take what's going on in their own society and then place it on the edge so they can deal with it, I think, a little bit. Yeah.
But it's also trying to deal with the mystery, like the mystery of something of resurrection, or the mystery of this is one of the strangest and most difficult mysteries that you find in scripture, which is the mystery of the leveret, the idea of how resurrection comes out of death through a taboo act, and so the incest of the leveret is justified, but in any other situation, the leveret is actually the idea of taking your brother's wife is completely a sin. Like, it's a sin, it's a taboo, it's unacceptable because it breaks the laws of causality. It breaks the laws of natural causality. It's like if you have a child with your brother's wife, then that child, like, what is he to you? He's a confused identity because he has multiple sources. And
is that your nephew or is that your son?
Exactly. And so that's the problem of incest, is that it actually breaks the world apart in confusion. But the idea, so you can understand that that's kind of what's happening on the edge of the world, all this confusion, all this breakdown. But in that darkness, you could almost say, like, despite that darkness, then a seed appears in that darkness that becomes the seed for the future world, and so it's very mysterious. It's a mysterious pattern, and it's a dangerous pattern if you take it the wrong way. Yeah. But it's also very much a Christian pattern.
So the thing that's really interesting to me about Mordred, right? So Arthur's illegitimate son, it's his nephew, but it's his son. Yeah. And by the way, there's that pattern, that basic pattern of accidental incest followed by a character who is your nephew, but then ends up killing you. That's actually also in Scandinavian legends. In fact, it's alluded to in Beowulf. And it's alluded to in this so almost every time in medieval literature, when the text makes a point of saying, and so was so-and-so's nephew, and he succeeded him, that's a way of saying that something happened there. Like it's like a nice way of saying, yeah, something happened here that shouldn't have happened. But so in the sort of the final version of the Arthurian legend, Mordred himself who rats on Lancelot and Guinevere. He's the one that reveals the adulterous affair of his aunt, who sort of been his mother, right? But of his aunt and King Arthur's best knight. Which what's interesting is, and T.H. White in his retelling of the story, he really suggests that Arthur probably knew this was going on the whole time. I mean,
Yeah.
how could you not know, right? But exposing the sin publicly in this way, like uncovering the nakedness, right, forces Arthur to confront it, and the resulting fallout destroys society, destroys the round table. So the sterility of Arthur's marriage and the way that it brings about the downfall of his kingdom, which is kind of the symbolic end, you could say, of the Trojan, Roman, British line. After that, it's the Saxons who come in, aka the English, right? They take over. But I think that this pattern is actually foreshadowed in the legend of Excalibur, right? The sword, Arthur's legendary sword. And so in the version that Malory has, there are two different swords. There's the sword and the stone, but that's not that one actually breaks.
Excalibur.
Yeah, that one actually breaks in battle. And so he's given Excalibur as a replacement by the Lady of the Lake. And again, there's this idea, there's this feminine presence in the water, which is related to, like, there are all these like sort of troublesome feminine characters in the Arthurian legend, and they're all tied to like bodies of water in some way. So, but in this case, it's a positive presence, right? So the feminine presence in the water, and she gives Arthur the gift. But what most people don't remember is that in the main version of the story, in Malory, it's not one gift, it's two gifts. There's the gift of the sword, and anybody injured with a sword will, like, the sword makes wounds that can't be healed. Okay, and that's what the sword does. But there's also a second gift, and the second gift is the scabbard.
Yep.
And in the legend, if you wear the scabbard, any injury that you're dealt will heal, right? And so basically there's this in the gift, there's the capacity to both wound and to heal. And of course, in Malory, the scabbard, which of course the word for scabbard in Latin is, I'll let people go look it up, but it's a sexual word. Like, where do you put a sword, right?
Yeah.
Early on in his career, Arthur is tricked out of the scabbard, the possession of the scabbard, which is the proper resting place for his sword, by Morgan Le Fay. So Morgan Le Fay actually tricks him out of the scabbard, steals it, and throws it into a lake. And so Arthur, for the rest of his life, he has the sword, but he doesn't have a proper resting place for the sword.
Yeah. Hence the sterility
right? And so the idea is that if you think about the way that Morgause and Morgan Le Fay are often sort of conflated as the same character, and so Morgause is, or Morgan Le Fay is the witch that steals Arthur's seed, right? So Arthur has this bastard child. It makes it impossible for him to bear a legitimate heir. And note that, by the way, we've now come full circle all the way back from the Greek princess that gave birth to the giant Albion, right? This idea that you had an improper union with a principality that results in the creation of this monstrous child. And so the resulting illegitimate heir of Mordred manifests here as Antichrist. And of course, the Arthurian legend ends with this apocalyptic battle, Camladen, where Mordred and Arthur injure each other. Arthur kills his son, and then Arthur is himself mortally wounded.
Yeah.
And what maybe a lot of people don't know is that in the Middle English alliterative Mort Arthur, Mordred is wielding another one of Arthur's sword, and the sword that he's wielding is the sword Clarent, which is Arthur's sword of peace. It's not supposed to be used in war. It's only supposed to be used to knight people and for other ceremonies, but it's never supposed to be drawn at violence. And you can think about, in going back to the apocalypse, the promise of peace that's associated with the beast, with the Antichrist, that this is what people believe he's going to bring. He's going to bring peace. So I think that Arthur's death, and it's notable that the most famous versions of his story are always called the death of Arthur. They never called that. There's no story called the life of King Arthur. There's the death of Arthur. And Arthur's death involves two movements that involve magical women in the sea. And the first is the return of the sword. So in Malory, Arthur instructs one of his knights to return Excalibur to the Lady of the Lake.
Yeah.
Of course, it takes 3 tries. The sword is beautiful. He doesn't want to throw it away, but he eventually casts it into the lake where the lady catches it and it returns to the place that it came from. And the second is the passage of Arthur himself. And this is, to me, one of the most mysterious things in medieval literature, is that Arthur is taken away to Avalon, to the island of apples, to be healed of his wound. And he's taken away by 3 magical queens, one of whom is Morgan Le Fay. Like, what's going on there? Why has she switched sides? What is happening? And so in Malory, to finish the story out, Guinevere and Lancelot end their lives with the only happy ending that you could have in a story like this, which is they both become monks. They both become monastics. And they end their lives, Lancelot as a hermit and Guinevere as the abbess of a monastery. They take monastic vows and they become holy. They repent, right? And so in this way, you can sort of see the sterility of Arthur's reign is transformed into the holiness of consecrated celibacy. So there's this resurrection that actually kind of takes place there. And Arthur himself continues to participate in this same pattern, which gives him birth. So he becomes the once and future king, which is almost the very last lines of the Death of Arthur, the Le Morte d'Arthur, is, here lies Arthur, the once and future king. So there's this idea that Arthur is going to return to Britain one day, in the eschaton, right? He becomes the once and future king. He becomes the seed that falls to earth or goes over the sea, to the margin. So he's going to spring up in that unlooked for place. And I think it's the fact that it's not just the Antichrist that's on the margin, but it's also the Messiah, the messianic figure that goes to the margin. So that when you reach there, you hit the Antichrist first, but then Christ is also there, right?
Yeah.
He's filled all things with himself.
Yeah, that's the image of Christ moving from east to west that you find in Scripture,
Yeah.
like that, like lightning, the moving from east to west.
Yes.
That that it's, and this is the hardest thing is to understand. So, for example, like you said, why is Morgan Le Fay there? Right? Why is Morgan Le Fay part of those that bring Arthur into this hidden place? For him to return.
Yeah.
And I think that this is of course these are attempts to try to deal with this problem, like to deal with the problem of the end and to deal with the problem of, how is it that things can start again without re-encompassing even, let's say, the dark elements of the story. It's difficult because, this is like the final image is the idea that somehow all of these things will participate in the eschaton in some transformed way. And it's hard to totally understand it. We can see it, like we can have a little glimpse of it. I think in the conversion of Rome is a place where we can have a glimpse of it, where as Rome was Antichrist, Rome destroyed the temple, Rome persecuted Christians, the emperors did all of that. But then in a strange turn, from Diocletian, who was also this persecuting emperor, to Constantine, who kind of flipped the story, but also reused the elements of the story, right? We have a sense that, there's a Puritan sense that we always kind of have in our mind, which is that Christ brings a kind of purity where all the things are going to be cast aside and there'll be something new, but that new has to be nonetheless made out of the gathering in of everything together. And so there's like a destruction and a recreation, but that return to potential and that bringing together of a new body has to be made out of that which was there before. And so what's the difference? This is a question that I have. Like, I'm not sure you can even answer that. What's the difference between the demon Surt, who gathers the fingernails of all the fallen to create a chariot on which to destroy the world? What's the difference between that and the resurrection of the dead? Like, there's a difference. Of course, there's a difference. There has to be. But the fact that they look like each other, makes it difficult. I think makes you understand why in Scripture there's a sense in which even Christians will be duped by Antichrist,
Right.
because it's going to look like the resurrection.
He says, even if it were possible, he would deceive, even if it were possible, the elect. Right. So the idea that a lot of people, and of course, this is why, St. John in his letter to his spiritual children, he's warning his there are many antichrist will come into the world. That's what he tells them. He's saying, listen, these antichrist figures are going to pop up, and people are going to say, oh, there's Christ. Oh, there's Christ. Oh, there's Christ. Right. And that every time somebody says that, you have to just be still, because when Christ, people will know, there won't be any ambiguity about it. Right. So this is interesting to me, because one is, I think that it's the difficulty in telling the difference between these two things that is why some Christians get hung up on the idea of universalism, because there is this sense in which all the margins are accounted for, but there's also the sense in which there will be some things that will be outside the walls of the city, and sort of perpetually, eternally, forever outside the walls of the city. Some things can't be integrated.
Yeah, one of the images of the New Jerusalem in Revelation, it says that all the glories of all the nations will be gathered into the New Jerusalem. Yeah. It's that's a beautiful way of understanding. It's all that which is glorious of all the stories will be gathered into that final image. But then there's also things that won't be gathered in. There are aspects which will, but it's hard to understand it because, okay, so here's another image. It also says that there will be no ocean.
Right. No more sea.
No more sea.
Yeah.
So that means that there's no remainder.
Yeah.
So I don't totally understand it. I mean, obviously I can't understand it, but it's this image of, on the one hand, this image of the New Jerusalem, because there are these images where it says that there are things that are outside, with the dogs, and there's all these images of what is outside of the New Jerusalem. But then there's also this image that there's nothing remaining. Yeah. These two contradictory images are difficult for me to reconcile. That's why Revelation is so difficult to think about.
Yeah. So this idea of the principality who's cut off and returns, right? Obviously, you have Arthur is the example that most people who are listening to this video are going to be really familiar with.
Yeah.
But I just want to point out that in the Middle Ages, this pattern manifests itself in places other than Britain. So, for instance, there are stories about the idea that Charlemagne is going to come back.
Really? I didn't know. Yeah. I had no idea.
Yeah, there are stories about the return of either Charlemagne or Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. The idea that, in the final showdown with the enemies of Christianity, right? In other words, that basically the final showdown with Islam, that Charlemagne or Frederick will return to lead the armies of the Christians in kind of one final battle. In Denmark, it's actually not a king. It's one of Charlemagne's paladins, Ogier the Dane, or Holger Dansk, who is he's the one that's going to return. And there's a 16th century legend about him actually conquering all of the countries from Jerusalem at the center of the world, all the way to paradise in the east. So the idea is that he went all the way from the center to the margin and basically converted all of them to the Christian faith. And so then the idea is that he's sleeping now, he's slumbering, right? And that he's going to come back and rescue Denmark, which is on the edge of the world, right? He's going to come back and rescue Denmark in its hour of need, kind of at the end of time. In your video with Dr. Mario, you talked about the marble emperor, right? This idea that Constantine Paleologus, that he, who dies in battle with the Turks, not all of the Byzantine emperors in the waning days of the empire were awesome people, let's just say. But
there's a reason why things wane.
Yeah,
it's not completely...
yeah. There's a reason why there's a reason they were in decline at that point.
Yeah.
But the last guy, I mean, he goes out the way that you're supposed to go out, right? He, at least from the perspective of a Germanic philologist, right? You're supposed to die facing the enemy, right? But there's this legend, that he didn't die, that he was basically turned into marble by an angel and buried beneath the gate of Constantinople, and that one day he'll awaken and he'll return. You
Hmm.
know, um, this
Yeah,
idea
there
of
are
the
these
mortal
stories, crazy stories about the fall of Constantinople, about how all the priests and the people serving that they were serving the liturgy during the attack, and that all the priests and the people actually kind of entered into the walls without finishing the liturgy, without reaching the point of communion, and that, you know, at the end they will come out and serve the last liturgy and but it's very romantic, but it also is a testimony to the pattern of this resurgence of light, the resurgence of the pattern itself, that how as the pattern breaks down, there is in that breakdown a promise that it's going to return inevitably, because it's what holds the world together.
So in that legend, I think there's something particular about the very Byzantine insistence, the very Christian insistence that there is something liturgical to the pattern of the world, right? So you can think about this idea that we find. I think that this is in St. Nicholas Kavasilas in his The Life in Christ, but I could be wrong. But there's this idea that we find in the Fathers that communion is the eschaton, right? That in some sense, and like this is why, and I know that you've recently had a conversation with Eugene Vodolaskin, which I'm really excited to see. But in his book, in Laurus, which I think is a really important book for where we are right now, you know, one of the main themes in Laurus is that a lot of people are anticipating the end of the world, because they're approaching the end of the 6th millennium since the creation of the world, according to the Byzantine reckoning. And so a lot of people are anticipating the end of the world. But there's this one point where one of the priests in the book basically says, listen, you don't know when the world is going to end, but you have a pretty good idea of when you're going to die. So prepare for that, right? like I know as a matter of fixed certainty that sometime in the next 50 or 60 years, I'm going to die. Like, you know, that's a, you know, you could bank on it, you know? And but there's this sense that, you know, that's kind of related to that, you know, when you take communion, you know, even if you're, you know, in some cities, you know, some cultures in the Middle Ages, you know, a lot of people only commune at Easter and Christmas, or only at Easter, you know, but this idea that communion is this is in St. Maximus. There we go. This in his ecclesiastical mystagogy, he talks about this idea, you know, that every part of the liturgy corresponds to a moment in the history of salvation, and that for instance, the dismissal of the catechumens is the last judgment, right? And so what's beyond that, which is the Eucharist, it's the liturgy of the faithful, you know, that's the eschaton, that's the life of God, the life of the Trinity, the life of the age to come. So you've got to prepare yourself for that. You know, don't worry about like, when is Jesus coming back? You know, like, we know that Jesus is coming to my mouth like this Sunday. So get ready, you know, confess and prepare yourself. But so this idea then that the liturgy is interrupted in the fall of Constantinople, and that it's going to be finished one day.
It's the eschaton itself, like
right.
You said.
Like that is that's a very true pattern. Like that idea would have made really deep intuitive sense to people in the Middle Ages. You know, even if it's like really fabulous or like difficult to get your, you know, like no one's treating it like as a historical, you know, fact or something like that. But there is a sense in which the liturgy was interrupted. But it is going to finish.
Yeah.
You know, like it will.
So maybe tell us about, tell us about the last emperor, the virgin that's found in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius.
So that's what I was getting to. And I think that we could get to the end of this and then just sort of tease Ethiopia, and then maybe come back and talk about Ethiopia in another video.
Yeah.
So this is in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. So there's this idea that we have in the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius. There are two ideas that are really important. One is the coming of the Antichrist, right? And of course, the apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius is really dealing with the rise of Islam and why is, Jesus has already come and the empire converted. So why are we losing?
Yeah.
Like, what's going on? But what's really interesting is that the actual Antichrist himself does not come from Islam in the apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, that he follows the church fathers in saying that the Antichrist is going to come from the tribe of Dan, that he's going to be one of these, in other words, from one of these Israelite tribes that was wiped out, that vanished, but is going to, again, resurface at the end, right? And so he talks about the Antichrist, and he says, this man is born at Chorazin and will be raised at Bethsaida and will rule at Capernaum. And Chorazin will be glad because he was born in her, and Bethsaida because he was raised in her, and Capernaum because he will have ruled in her. So he's quoting Old Testament prophecies. And then he says, for this reason, in the gospel, the Lord 3 times passed a sentence of woe, saying, woe unto thee, Chorazin, woe unto thee, Bethsaida, and unto thee, Capernaum, if thou hast been exalted unto heaven, thou shalt be brought down to hell. So these are the places where Christ did like most of his earthly ministry, and those are the places where the Antichrist is going to manifest in the last days. So that's one pattern, this pattern of Antichrist. The other pattern that we see coming up here at the end of the apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius is the idea of the last king of the Romans. That's how he's referred to in this. In the Latin version of the text, he's called the Rex Romanorum, so the king of the Romans. So in other words, the last Roman emperor. And there's this idea that the last Roman emperor survives, like sort of hidden, that the line of the emperors sort of survives hidden within the nation of Ethiopia. And that in the last days, the last Roman emperor manifests himself, and he rules over sort of like one last moment of Christian revival, of Christian conquest over their enemies, of Roman conquest over their enemies, because there's the same thing by this time, before the Antichrist comes. And that when the Antichrist comes, this is what it says. It says the king, in other words, the last Roman emperor, will take the crown from his head. So he'll take the crown off of his head and he will place it on the cross. And then he will spread out his hands to the heaven and deliver the kingdom of the Christians to God. And then the cross will be taken up into heaven along with the king's crown. So this is a prophecy, and this is a long time. This is written several centuries before the fall of the Roman Empire, right? That it prophesies that there's a day coming when the king's crown, so the Roman Empire will still sort of exist, but only Christ will only have Christ as an emperor, because the earthly empire will have been brought to an end.
And it's almost like it's the end, but it's the resolution within that end.
Right.
It's like it's becoming fully what it was supposed to be in its end at the same time.
And an interesting manifestation of this is when, in the Orthodox Church, we put our bishops partially in the garb of the Byzantine emperors. Yeah. Right. The sakos, the main vestment of the bishop is. It's not originally an episcopal vestment. It's an imperial vestment. Even Charlemagne, when he was coronated, he sent off to Byzantium to get one because he wanted to associate himself. So when Charlemagne was crowned, he was coronated in the garb of a Byzantine emperor.
Interesting.
Very deliberate.
Yeah, well, I know that he really wanted to see himself as the continuation of the Byzantine Empire. Yeah, in his succession, he succeeds Irene's dead husband, basically.
Right. So when we put our bishops in this garb, one of the things that we're sort of saying by that is that the kingdom continues, but now it's totally vested in Christ. Right. And of course, the bishop is just like the icon, the living icon, of Christ within the community of Christians. So it says that when this happens, that the cross will be taken up into heaven along with the king's crown, because the cross on which our Lord Jesus Christ was hanged for the sake of the common salvation of all, the cross itself will commence to appear before him at his coming as a refutation of the treachery of unbelievers. And the prophecy of David will be fulfilled, which says, in the last days, Ethiopia shall stretch out her hands unto God, because from the seed of the sons of Chusith, the daughter of Phul, the king of Ethiopia, these last will stretch out their hands to God. So again, there's this idea that the last Roman emperor somehow survived or endured in Ethiopia, manifested in the last days, and then the kingdom, and then hands the kingdom over to Christ.
Yeah, and it makes sense in terms of the role of Ethiopia. We'll talk about it in another episode of what, let's say, the cosmic role of Ethiopia seems to be in this universal story, for sure.
And so and then from that point, the story goes kind of the place that you would expect it to go, which is the Antichrist rules over mankind in the absence of the true Roman emperor. Things get really bad. The faithful are persecuted, and then Christ returns, and the righteous shine forever as stars in the world. Which is how it ends.
Interesting.
So it's a really beautiful, you could sort of say, extension of Revelation. Like, there's nothing in the which, by the way, one of the things that you get a kick out of is that early on in the apocalypse we get the origin of dog-headed men, like which son of Noah they're descended from. So just I'll tease that out there for people who want to go looking for it.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's
we can guess.
Yeah, but I really love the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius because it really functions as an extension of Revelation. Like, there's nothing in it that's incompatible. Like, the two sort of map onto each other really well. And what the Apocalypse is doing is it's trying to of Pseudo-Methodius is doing is it's trying to clarify what's the role of Rome. It's trying to clarify when the Roman Empire falls, and this is, hundreds of years before it falls, but when the Roman Empire falls, is Christianity invalidated? Does it cease to exist? And the answer is no. That basically this pattern that we first see in the Apocalypse of St. John, and that we see foreshadowed in Alexander, in Constantine, in Nero, like all these patterns, that they continue to work themselves out in a way that is consistent with the ultimate victory of Jesus Christ, right? The sign of the coming of the Son of Man, as the text says.
Yeah, and there's also a sense in which Rome persists. Even today, people think that's a funny idea, but the ideal of Rome is still continued on. Whether it is in the two-headed eagle that ended up in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or the same two-headed eagle that ended up in the Russian Empire. They saw themselves as a continuation of Rome. Whether historians like that or not, or whether they think it's legitimate or not, it means that the Rome had not yet passed, and in a way, Rome hasn't yet passed. I would say we're very close to the end of Rome in a bigger scale, because it's like the idea of Rome is kind of has this weird last glimmer in the unified Europe, but it's a kind of strange, perverted, fragmented version of it. But the idea of Rome is still there, and it's not completely dead.
So can I throw one last idea at you?
Go for it, and then we'll have another conversation.
Yeah. So Tsar Nicholas II, the last Russian Caesar, right? It's to the point where it's, maybe sort of a meme of like these young guys who convert to Orthodoxy and then just develop the biggest possible man crush on Tsar Nicholas II. Like, I don't know if you've noticed this.
Oh yeah. Well, you see it in the facial hair.
Yeah.
We don't even have to ask them, because they start to sport the hair, the same facial hair as Tsar Nicholas.
Yeah. So what's really interesting to me here is that I think that this is that same pattern manifesting itself, that the seed is cut off, right? And then it springs up again in what's the most unlikely place in the world for the veneration of a Russian emperor to spring up. I would say West Virginia, I would say Texas, there's, in America, we have multiple layers of, we don't like kings, but also like we don't like Russians. And so, for the veneration of like the last Russian emperor to spring up in such a surprisingly strong way, You know, the devotion, you know, to the royal family.
But it's also because
family.
everybody knows that there's a relationship between Britain and Russia.
Right.
In terms of that final emperor.
Yeah.
Like that the connection is so strong that one of them became a saint. It's like it's so it's
that's one of our family saints. That's my daughter is named after Saint Elizabeth.
And so it's not as far, again, just like the idea of Troy and Arthur and Constantine and Arthur, you know, in these surprising joining together, the connection between the extreme east and the extreme west, or the, you know, these two extremes of the world in the character of Tsar Nicholas is something which I think is playing a narrative function as well.
And that's, I mean, so in our last episode, you famously said that America is the whore of Babylon. So, but we're also,
and I stand by that.
I know, it's fine. We're also the end of the world.
Yes,
right?
I agree.
Sort of in fact, one of the things that's, I'm going to try to have a conversation, I think, with Paul Vanderklay about why did the medieval model, why did we lose it? Like, what happened? Why did that transition happen? And one of the things that people don't always understand is that one of the things that brings about the end of the medieval model is the discovery of the New World. That there is such an influx of resources, gold and other things from the New World. Like, we can't even understand how much it just destroyed the traditional trade networks and economic things that were kind of holding Western Europe together. But basically, you know, but America is the sort of, it is the end. It's the in one sense, like, it's the ultimate margin.
Yeah.
Right. Especially a place
California.
like California. Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting to. California, Seattle, right? That these are they're it's as far west as you can go. Like, that's the end. It is. You can't go west any farther. After that, it's east.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
But there's something also interesting. Like, if you look at California, it's interesting how you can see some of the seeds. How can I say this? Like, California also has a microcosmic form, like structure, and it has aspects of it which is actually the most like traditional,
right?
You know, most spiritually alive place, and also the worst degeneracy that you can ever imagine in the same spot.
Where was Father Seraphim Rose?
That's right.
He's in California.
He's in California.
Like, he's like, as you know, like as sort of like hardcore traditionalist as you could sort of possibly imagine, right?
Yeah.
Because it's the same thing. It's, you get to the edge, you get to the end of the world, and all that's left is the remainder. You know, so
King Arthur will land, you know, on the West Coast somewhere in California.
Maybe, I wouldn't be like totally surprised if that happened, honestly. But anyway, I think that Tsar Nicholas I think that he is manifesting, he's manifesting this pattern. And that's why, like, I don't really mind. Like, I'm happy to see, you know, a lot of these guys, like, they know intuitively, like, in their hearts, they need a king, you know, and, you know, of course, then ultimately that's Christ, but then to also like have this deep love for kind of like the last emperor who is manifesting again, you know, as a saint. He's manifesting again in the most unlikely of places.
Yeah.
I think that's another way that we see this pattern kind of playing out in the Orthodox Church right now. And I do think it's actually ultimately a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I think so too. All right. Yeah. Well, look, I think this might have been the longest conversation that I've had in probably on my channel.
How long was it?
I don't know, like an hour and a half maybe. Which is totally cool.
I didn't even notice that.
It was great. And so next conversation, we will definitely go into all the mysteries of Ethiopia, and I'm looking forward to that, definitely. So thanks everybody for your time and your energy. And Richard, go ahead and plug again all the things you're involved in, because that's great stuff.
The big thing is, of course, I'm on the Amon Sûl podcast. If you want to hear me talk Tolkien, I'm actually pretty excited about this next episode that'll be coming out on the 10th of June, because I had Dr. Lisa Kudris back on to talk about Marian figures in Tolkien's Legendarium. And this is the like, I'm always nervous about talking about the Mother of God, because I feel like she's the sort of, like, you just can't talk about her. You have to venerate an icon. I don't know what else to say. And yet I keep finding myself places where I am talking about her. So this is like the most Marian thing that I've ever done on the internet. And I'm pretty excited about this episode. We are also still working on getting a website up for a book that I want to publish, and hopefully you'll be contributing to it, and some other people will be contributing to it. It's called Finding the Golden Key: Essays on toward a Recovery of the Sacramental Imagination, and it's kind of, I'm hoping it's going to be sort of a nexus for this project of reenchantment that we've all kind of been involved in. So look for that. I'm hoping the website will go up in the next week or two, and people will be able to actually submit abstracts for essays to be included in the volume. So,
all right, everybody. So stay tuned, and we'll definitely be back with some other surprising and wonderful stories. So thanks, everybody.